Okay, let's begin unraveling what some of this terminology means down here, as well as some terminology that you don't see here. First of all, I want to talk about this term, basic versus dynamic. Now, when you look here in my disk management console, these are all basic partitions, and in fact, the word basic does not refer to a partition at all, but it refers to the entire physical drive. You can see that over here. Disk 0 is a basic disk. Disk 1 is a basic disk. Disk 2 is a basic disk, and so on. They're all basic disks. I don't have any dynamic disks. So let me explain what I mean by the difference between the two. A basic disk, or the disk type basic here, means that this is a self-contained disk, and a partition cannot cross over from one disk to another. It can only be used within the confines of that physical disk. That's a basic disk. Now, if I were to click on here, this disk, I'm going to right click there, and you can see I can convert it to dynamic. If I convert two of these to dynamic, then I could make these partitions span from one disk to another. I'm not going to do that, and the reason I'm not going to is because I can't change it back again without losing everything. So most of the time we simply use a basic one. If I use a dynamic and cross over these partitions from one disk to another, I can make several kinds. Now, first, let's talk about this. These terms here. Let's talk about simple here. Simple is it's a partition level term. That is to say, if I have a basic disk, meaning that the partitions cannot cross over from one to the other, then each of these partitions is a simple partition. A simple partition is one that can only live within the confines of that physical disk. But if I were to make these dynamic, I have some other options. I can make them simple. I can make them span, where one spans across two different disks. So I could make one of these. Let's say I've got 1 gigabyte drive here. This is a solid state disk, and I've got a 4 gigabyte terabyte, I mean 1 terabyte drive here, a 4 terabyte drive here, and I could make these a big 5 terabyte drive, right, if I span them. I can also make them striped. Let's say that I've got, let's just take these two. They're not the same size, but let's say that I made these two striped. It would mean that if I write a file, it's going to write a block of data here, and then a block of data to this one, then a block of data to this one, a block of data to this one, until the file is completely written. Now, why would I do that? Well, because I can write it twice as fast. Since I can write information to both of these at the same time, I can write the file in half the time. Now, the problem is if I lose one of these, I've lost everything, because half of all of my files are missing. So I can, if I wanted to, stripe them and increase efficiency. I can also mirror them. If these were mirrored, then I would write the entire file here and an entire file here, an entire file here, entire file here. So if I lost one of these two, I would not lose all my data, because it would be mirrored or replicated to the other disk. So that is the layout. If these are dynamic, I can make these simple, spanned, striped, or mirrored. By the way, we can see that over here. If I make this dynamic, then I can turn this into a span drive, striped drive, or a mirrored drive, rather than just a simple drive. Yes, I did have another option called RAID, but we're not going to get into RAID right now. Now let's talk about the file system. The file system has to do with the organization of the files and the naming of files and folders on the volume. There have been several. FAT, or File Allocation Table, was the earliest of them. It was a very simple system, and it did not include some things such as security. By that I mean, let's go to a folder here and go down to Properties, and you can see in the Security tab I can say, well, who can have access to this? Different users on my network, or different users on my computer as they log in may or may not have access to this folder. you cannot do that with a fat drive. You can only do that with this NTFS type drive. Also, the fat file system cannot support files larger than 4 gigabytes. Every once in a while I get a student who decides they're going to try to put their virtual Windows on a thumb drive, a flash drive, and it doesn't work because they're usually set to a fat type of volume file system, and they can only handle a 4 gigabyte file, which is not big enough for that virtual machine, so it fails. NTFS does have that security option, and it can support up to 16 exabytes, which is a huge number. I'm not going to get into what that means now, but it's a huge number. And NTFS is the new technology file system. Ever since Windows NT came out, Windows is typically installed on an NTFS formatted drive. CDFS is the CD file system, UDF is the DVD file system, and then Microsoft's newest one is REFS, Resilient File System, which is around but not typically used on home machines. In fact, you cannot install Windows on an REFS file system. It's used primarily for storage devices, such as what we call NAS or SAN units, and I'm not really going to get into those because those are enterprise level types of units, although you might have a NAS on your home machine. If I go here to my file system, you see I have a NAS drive here. It's just a network drive that stands alone by itself on the network that I can write my backups to. So those can be set to the REFS or formatted to the REFS file system. Okay, I'm going to take a break here because we're 7 minutes into this, and then I will continue this in part 3 of the storage system lectures.